them. I'm joined by economist and Irish Independent columnist Dan O'Brien, Dr Niamh Hourihan of the Department of Sociology at UCC, former Fianna Fáil TD and Minister Conor Lenihan, and by Colleran, columnist with The Star and former editor of that paper. Dan O'Brien, I suppose the first question we should ask ourselves really is there anything wrong with the politicians we do elect at the moment?
Well, I think a lot of the explanation for the trouble we've got into, this in the recent past, back in the 80s and the 50s, has to do with political failure. Not everything that goes wrong in our country is down to politicians, but in my view, our political class has not been forward-thinking, it hasn't prepared for things, it hasn't looked ahead to see what sort of risks there were. So, for instance, during the recent bubble, there was the famous time when the former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern said the people who warned about something going wrong should commit suicide, went to that extreme to say, hey, everything's okay, let's not do anything. So I would certainly think that a lot of our problems are to do with our political class, and in turn I would say a lot of it is to do with the way we elect our politicians. So let me just give an example. When we go into a self-service restaurant, if the fatty foods are first and the salad bar is second, we tend to load up on fatty foods and have less salad. You switch it around, you put the salad first, the fatty food at the back, people then tend to eat more salad. In my view, our electoral system is a little like that. We go in, we go for the easy gratification, we get the politicians who will fix our roofs, as we saw in the clip there, rather than people who are going to be focusing on bigger picture issues for the entire country. It's perfectly rational with our system for people to vote for locally focused politicians. My argument is that if we had a different electoral system, people would make different choices.
OK, well, Conor Lenihan, you were a TD, I think, for 14 years and a minister. Were you salad or fatty food?
That's a good question, I suppose. The bottom line, I would say, agreeing to a certain extent with Dan, is that the political system in Ireland has not been reformed. I know we had some promises in the last election in 2011 from the current government that there would be a significant or a seismic change and reform. We haven't seen that in the last 5 years, and I think there was a great opportunity not just to reform the political system itself, but to reform the whole structure, the underlying structure of public spending and public provision in this country. I think two issues more than any else highlight for me the failure of our state system in Ireland over the last 5 years. One was that Savita case in Galway, and again this case in recent weeks down in the southeast, where somebody was neglected for quite a significant time. And both of these are not just system failures, but they're failures of what I would call basic administration in this country. And really, my own experience reflecting on 14 years in the Dáil is that a lot of the people who are sent to Leinster House by the electorate to be responsible and to legislate on policy and to devolve and evolve and develop policy at a very significant level, a national parliament, are actually spending 40 to 70% of the time fixing small, micro issues like medical cards, like social welfare benefits for people, getting people on the housing list and these kind of things. And you know, unless that's tackled, and the only way I can see of tackling it is a mixture of electoral reform, because the electoral system itself almost encourages this kind of competition around these issues. Okay. And unless you invest in local government and have elected, I would believe that profoundly that directly elected local mayors would solve a great deal of this problem that we have in a national parliament.
Well, that's a big question, would they? Niamh, you've written a very good book, Rule Breakers, about this whole area. I guess the reason politicians spend their time looking at local issues and sorting out medical cards and everything is because that's what people expect of them, that's what people want them to do.
People will vote for them if they do that. There's some very interesting research if we look at the Oireachtas Joint Committee reports. A number of them showed that, for instance, in the case of a sitting politician who has in previous times lost his seat, he would spend over 66% of his time doing constituency work, as opposed to the 40% of the time that a politician who has never lost their seat will do it. But I suppose I would have a concern that the issue of constituency work is focused in as being kind of the core issue and the core problem, because with the political system the way that we have it right now, power is very highly centralised in cabinet. Backbenchers don't actually have a huge input to everything else that's going on, so constituency work is something for them to do. It does result in small injustices. So for instance, if there's a finite amount of money to pay for medical cards. Last year in Kerry, in the first 8 months, there were 2,500 representations made by politicians in Kerry about medical cards. Now, if any of those are successful, that suggests that if it's a finite pot, some people who may deserve medical cards may not get them because of those representations. And Irish people don't really think through what are the fairness implications for their own representations and their own engagement with politicians. But I suppose, David, where I think the important distinction is to be made is to, while that results in small injustices, if we look at what caused the banking crisis, that was those behaviours ratcheted up to a macro level. If we look at the number of developers, for instance, who were involved with Niamh, that's less than 200 people. It's a very small group of people who were engaged in the kind of similar behaviours but which operated at a completely different level. And I think that's, if we want to look at the heart and the core of the political system, that's where we need to start. And it's very interesting, in fairness, despite the weakness in terms of political reform, it's interesting to look at the lobbying legislation that's been introduced and how that's already functioning for its strengths and its weaknesses. One of the interesting questions on lobbying.ie, it starts with the question, am I lobbying? And it's very interesting when you go down, you think, actually, we've all lobbied at some level.
Well, if you're going looking for a medical card, asking your TD to use his influence,
lobbying in some shape or form.
Okay.
And that's where, you know, I spent a number of weeks in North Tipperary interviewing people who voted for McCullagh in particular, because he's one of the politicians who's very devoted to local constituency work and has been criticised in the report of the Moriarty Tribunal. And I suppose realistically, he wasn't in front of the Moriarty Tribunal because he was making representations about medical cards or potholes or street lighting. It was for different behaviours. When I interview people who vote for him, they say, well, I don't care about those different behaviours because I'm getting my medical card. And I think people do need to recognise this. By not caring about that, you do risk a banking crisis.
Okay.
And that's where the key point has to be made.
Jerry Colleran, no more than myself, the hurler on the ditch, I suppose, which is a very easy position to be in. But the politicians we get, I mean, we, the people, choose them, we elect them, we vote for them.
We do, and I suppose the essential question there is, do we get the politicians we deserve? And of course, the answer to that has to be, sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. Clearly, nobody could really argue that the people in Germany got the politicians they deserved in the 30s. Unless one takes a very negative view of the German people. But sometimes we were very lucky in this country since independence to get class politicians, really good, principled statements like politicians. For instance, Cosgrave, he could have done enormous damage to the democratic system. He handed over power to De Valera. De Valera behaved, kept us out of the war, saved countless number of Irish lives, and nevertheless gave huge support to the Allies while doing that. And then we came to a period in Irish society, and Dan has referred to it earlier, where there seems to have been introduced into the political establishment a contaminant that infected the establishment and turned it to work against the interests of the people occasionally.
But if you look at newspaper commentary, and it wasn't quite as unrestrained as it would be now, but if you look at newspaper commentary about Cosgrave, about De Valera, about Lemass, it's kind of not particularly complimentary at the time.
It isn't, and I think it is a great mistake. I think those people really serve the country.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is, if you look at, they weren't seen at the time as necessarily the paragons that looking back.
But looking back.
And they also, if you look at the backbenchers in some of the Dáils that they elected them as Taoiseach, they wouldn't be any better than the backbenchers we have now. But
if you look at the essential power that the ordinary person has, we as citizens have, over the politicians that we eventually produce, it's very, very slight. There's a whole distortion and interruption between the decision-making of the ordinary citizen and what eventually turns out. For instance, we have the party political system that selects the candidates. We have the proportional representation system. We don't know which part of our vote will eventually end up electing somebody. Then we have the post-election negotiations, and then we have whatever happens after that. So therefore, the amount of input that the individual or the citizens as a whole have really in deciding who will be in the administration afterwards or in the Dáil and generally is very problematic.
Dan, I think you're in favour of some kind of a list system, maybe something like in New Zealand or in Germany, the mixed member proportion.
Well, I think because we've got so used to the system that we have, and we do expect our politicians to deliver, I certainly think people are attached to that. So my proposal would be that we elect half our TDs with the current system, and then when we go to vote, we have another ballot paper, and it has a party. and we put an X beside the party. And half of the TDs come from that, and half of the TDs come in the way we elect them now. So we'd have half of our TDs would be more nationally focused, and we'd hopefully have a sort of more forward-looking, more alert group of politicians who would look for the national picture, and then we'd have half of our TDs who would look after our local needs as we have now. That would be possibly the best of both worlds. No electoral system is perfect, but I think you might possibly get a good balance that way.
Okay, Niamh, what do you think of that? Because it sounds to me like you'd end up with half of the Dáil being made up of constituency slaves, if for want of a better word.
Well, I mean, I think there is a very strong case to be made that for those who are sitting in cabinet, given how centralised our system is, that there should be a way for them to opt out of constituency work. I think it's unfair, given the amount of power that ministers have, that they are essentially competing in a PR system with ordinary backbenchers in terms of constituency work. But also there's a workload issue. One of the things that hasn't been explored, David, even in the context of the structures that we have there now, for instance, the Taoiseach could take 2 people from the Seanad and include them in cabinet. So there could be more creative ways of bringing more nationally
focused. Well, it has been explored.
Yeah,
like this has been around.
It has been around for a while, and yet there seems to be incredible resistance. If we look, for instance, in Fianna Fáil, the last time out, were flagging the kind of opt-out from cabinet model, but one got the sense that people were very concerned of, well, what happens if I opt out of my constituency, if I'm on a national party list or if I'm in cabinet, and then 5 years down the road there's a cabinet reshuffle, what happens to me?
Well, let's put that to the former practising politician, because one of the virtues of constituency work, I guess, is that you get to hear what your constituents think, and you'll normally be told in no uncertain terms what your constituents think. Presumably that's, in some ways, is a benefit, because otherwise the danger is that people in cabinet don't realise what's going on the ground.
There's a certain amount of anchoring, all right, anchoring the individual in terms of the constituency work. But I do believe profoundly now, having gone through it for 14 years, and I'm not trying to claim I was some sort of angel concentrating constantly on the national business. I mean, of course, like anybody else, I think the average, as Niamh says accurately, is about 40% of your time is caught up. I regard that as profoundly wasted time, and I think so, not just in the Irish context. I think globally there's a big issue here, because we're seeing an awful lot of globalisation of decision making to, large supranational bodies, whether it be the EU, the UN on climate change, the WTO on trade, and really you need a very vibrant group of politicians in your national parliament looking at those wider global issues, because they do have an effect and an impact here in Ireland as well. And you also need to look at how you move decision making back to the local level where it's very relevant to people. So, I think Ireland isn't alone in facing this. We do have this very competitive electoral system where you end up competing with your member from the same party, and I think that really does introduce a kind of hyper competition into the equation, which is not to the benefit. And I think one of the big profound lessons I learned from my own 14 years, which were entirely in government, and then looking at the experience of other members opposite us who spent maybe 14 years in opposition and longer, is that one of the problems of our system is that a significant number of the cadre of experienced people can lose their seats, like happened to Fianna Fáil in 2011. So you don't have a very robust opposition, and this is a very serious issue. If you want the kind of scrutiny that Dan spoke about of big national or international developments, how they impact here in Ireland, that if you don't have the experienced talent retained within the system, then you have a period maybe of 14 years, and I would say this
the people's choice to
very
get rid of them if they want to.
Very frankly, I think we were very well served in our 14-year electoral run from 97 to 2014 by weak opposition, and part of that was due to that our electoral system makes it very easy for very talented people who are making a national contribution to be removed.
Well, I can't say I agree at all with the notion that some of our parliamentarians should be relieved of the duty to ask us for our votes. I don't go along with the list system. You could have people on the list system interminably who never, on one occasion, would ask some citizen for his support in the ballot. And so therefore I don't see that, and I don't see what is wrong with local parliamentary representatives being aware of what's happening at the grassroots and having that connectedness to the people that they represent. I can't see what the fetish is with the constant criticism of constituencies, they've been represented properly at national level. I can't see why there can't be a marriage between properly representing the constituencies and having the national and global view as well. What is the problem with that?
But Ger, there's only so many hours in a week.
Workload.
And if people are travelling up and down between their constituencies and Dublin to be parliamentarians, they're dealing with their constituency work, they're trying to read, they're trying to keep abreast of the issues. You know, if we saw last week with the members of the banking inquiry, they were asked, would they do it again? And nearly all of them said that they had this issue, that they lost out time in their constituencies. Now, what should a national parliamentarian be doing?
No, I'm not saying
doing this sort of inquiry work, but they felt that they were losing out personally because they couldn't do their constituency work.
It strikes me as entirely elitist that one would have a proposal put to or that it would be a reality in this country that you could have possibly have people in our national parliament who wouldn't have the requirement to ask people for their ballot.
Well, there are different ways of doing it, but in fairness, there are many other countries that do it. So are you saying that all those countries are elitist and we're not?
Yes, I think that there's a mistake there. I think the closer we are to the people who actually put their 1, 2s and 3s on a ballot paper, the better. I think, yes. I'm not saying that there aren't faults in the system.
That the process of being asked for a vote makes the vote part of a transaction. A number of politicians I interviewed talked about the turn for the vote. So that I go and I do a turn for you, David, and then on election day I expect you to come and reciprocate.
And you would hope that the turn at some stage might be running the country.
And
well.
That's the basis for that. But you know, we saw the turn for the vote go horribly wrong when it went up the layer to the elite, as you say. But in fairness, if we look at the potential for creating some part of a list system, it does actually ask people to focus more on party ideologies rather than the individual day-to-day work that people are doing.
It also gives a lot of power to the party machinery to say who's going to be on the list and where they're going to be on the list, and instead of giving it to the people.
And
one of the virtues of PRSTV is we can vote for the party we like, and within that we can vote for the candidate.
But also it does, again, heighten the constituency work, because the politicians who have more competition, it's very interesting to look at what Fianna Fáil have done this time around and how little competition they have created for a number of their candidates, because politicians who are competing against their own party have to do more constituency work.
One point you raised earlier, you mentioned the report of the Committee on the Constitution that was carried out in 2010, I think, a survey of how much time politicians devoted to constituency work, and that same report also looked at Malta. Malta is the only other country that uses PRSTV for electing a national parliament, and they did the same survey with them, and they did much less constituency work. Now, there might be other factors involved, but it does suggest that it might not be the electoral system alone that's causing
David,
demand.
I lived in Malta for 2 years, and it is very different. They only have 2 parties. It's extremely polarised, and people, it's really, you know, it's a very fine balance, and people stick with the same party, so they don't have the same inter-constituency competition in Malta.
But you have to remember as well, David, that a lot of constituency work is about politicians making representations to rule-based systems, be it public services. One of the striking things that came across when I was doing the research in 2011 is how much time politicians were spending engaging with banks, which they would all say this is a new thing. And in many cases, they were asking banks to do things which they were supposed to be doing under the regulations, but they were just not doing. They were often ignoring people engaging with them.
So we own all the banks. It's kind of understandable now.
So, you know, and I think, you know, the volume of constituency work is also a reflection on how our rule-based systems operate. So, for instance, the 2,500 people who requested representations about medical cards are all saying we actually don't trust the fairness of the medical card system.
But it seems to be a theme that the crisis that has that develops in this country, and for which we'll be paying intergenerational for, it seems to be that the punishment is going to be incurred by the people who have suffered this by taking away their access to democratic imperative. And that is wrong. I mean, there was more a personnel failure than a systems failure here. People let the side down.
Is that because we're electing the wrong sort of person, though? Instead of electing experts, we're electing national school teachers in droves and secondary school teachers in droves and small town solicitors in droves, instead of, you know, people who are actually experts in areas that we need expertise.
Well, I would submit that and I'm not usually an optimist or a positive type oriented in terms of politics, but I mean, I think this country has done rather well with the system we've had since independence. We've had the most outstanding disasters, but it hasn't been the system that has been the problem. It hasn't been the grassroots voters. It hasn't been the voters at all. It has been a cadre of political elites who essentially handed the country over to business and bankers and developers and turned the place into an economy where everybody had to have a mortgage, and the whole thing went crazy as a result. Those are the people that are responsible, and you cannot then turn around and say that the people that are going to be punished for that are the ordinary voters.
Yeah, Conor.
Well, if I can just say, I think Ger's taking a very short-term view of it. I would look at this more as an issue that starts in Ireland in the 1960s, when we actually start getting prosperous and we can actually afford a very large administrative, we'll call it welfare state. But if you look at that time frame from the 60s onwards to today, there's been very little political and administrative reform. The creation of the Ombudsman's office, which doesn't really solve and vindicate the rights that Ger is speaking about, that's why they come to TDs. That's a very minor piece of legislation in the context of a 30 years from the 60s onwards. So, you know, we really don't hold power to account, and I mean bureaucratic as well as democratic power. And one of the disadvantages that I would still insist in this system, where 40% of the time is being spent by opposition members in particular on constituency work, is that they're not in a position then to very robustly take on the government of the day, challenge the kind of legislation and policies. And more often, not flattering you or the media, but more often it's left to the media and other outlets of accountability to call into question these policies rather than the people in Parliament.
What about the point Ger was making about the cadre who let us down, which I presume would include yourself?
Well, there was a period, I think, you know, there's no kind of mystery about this, where the world was the subject of very low interest rates. There was an international recession hit here, and yes, the party in government I was part of let the eye off the ball and went along with the concepts of loose regulations in the financial markets. And you know, I don't believe that's the cause of a much broader malaise in the Irish political system, which goes back quite a long time before this particular period. It's very noticeable when you talk to older members, as I've done, thanks to, I suppose, to the luck, I suppose, of being born in a political family, to talk to people who were in that parliament before the 60s and how little constituency work they did. And actually they were focused, despite what people would say, on national and international issues. So you know, there is an issue here that we are living in a very globalised world. 90% of what Ireland produces is for export. So we're very linked at one level, but our political systems don't and administrative don't reflect that. And I think that's a big problem.
One of the points about you're making a point about people back in the 50s or whatever weren't doing as much constituency work, possibly because their constituents weren't able to get hold of them. And Niamh, in your book, it's quite striking how TDs today are talking about the amount of emails they're getting, the amount of tweets they're getting, the amount of requests on Facebook they're getting, all for doing constituency work.
Well, the real characteristic always of the Irish political system and Irish political culture was this emphasis on the face-to-face, you know, and we're still going to see that now over the next couple of weeks with the door-to-door canvass. And even, you know, Michael Marsh's most recent research showed that, like, the door-to-door canvass is still really important. People like to be asked for their vote because it's the commodity that they trade. But there are some elements of the face-to-face that have disappeared. So, for instance, churchgate collections are gone, local commons are gone, a lot of clinics have gone down, but that is being replaced by social media, where people are engaging. And in many cases, politicians were talking about being overwhelmed by the volume of contacts they were getting on social media. But once they had sifted through all of those contacts, generally when they started to work with people, it was back to the face-to-face again. Do you know what I mean? It was back to the human contact. And I suppose this is the thing, I think, where we're not recognising a weakness. If we look at, say, the ombudsman approach to having a system failure. So, for instance, you have a problem with a school or with a bank and you can't get a result. If we look at the way kind of the ombudsman model works, it's like the thing goes wrong and then you complain and then it's a black mark against the institution. Whereas most people don't actually care about any of that. All they want is a result. And if you go to a politician, they will pick up the phone and you're much more likely to get a result. And in our current way of creating transparency and accountability, we're not actually recognising that people are more interested in results than kind of black marks against institutions.
Dan, does that mean that changing the electoral system isn't going to solve the underlying problem, with the underlying problem being that our structures aren't responsive enough and don't actually deliver what they're supposed to deliver?
I'll come back to the earlier point. If you put the salads up front, you change the way, what in economics speak, the choice architecture, people will choose, they still have the freedom to choose things, but will make different choices because they no longer will have that same incentive always to say, I need to vote for the guy who delivers because the constituency, the people in the constituency next door will do. If they do, they'll get the stuff and we'll lose out. So there's an incentive for people to vote for the person who will deliver the bacon to the constituency. And if you change the architecture, I think that will go some way to changing the outcome.
Okay, well, let's think a little bit about the voters, because President Higgins made some comments the other day which attracted some controversy about parties offering tax cuts. But he also said it's not only a matter of the political parties. You must ask yourself about the state of consciousness in the public. Thinking ethically means thinking about long-term consequences as opposed to short-term benefit or opportunities. That's a quote from an interview in the Irish Times. So maybe we as voters have questions to answer as well. And now, on our behalf, our colleagues in Colleran Live asked their Amaric research panel a couple of questions to find out if people had some fairly basic political knowledge as they prepare to choose our next government. We first asked which party has promised to abolish the USC entirely by 2020. 54% got the answer right, saying Fine Gael, while 20% thought it was Sinn Féin, 13% said Labour, and 12% said Fianna Fáil. The panel did better on identifying the Minister for Agriculture. 78% correctly said it was Simon Coveney, but 10% thought it was Alan Kelly, who is, of course, Minister for the Environment. 6% thought it was Brendan Smith, who was Minister for Agriculture 5 years ago, and another 6% thought it was Peadar Tóibín of Sinn Féin, who has never been a minister. The message that has got through the most is about a wealth tax. Asked which party is proposing one, no less than 80% correctly said Sinn Féin, but 8% thought it was Fianna Fáil, 7% said Labour, and 5% of the panel, that's one person in 20, thought that Fine Gael wants to introduce a wealth tax, which will probably cause some scratching of heads. So, I mean, is there an onus, Niamh, is there an onus on the public to be properly informed about all this sort of stuff when they go to vote, or is that just idealistic? They'll only take in the broad
I think it is
strokes?
a bit idealistic. My sense of the public, such as I encountered them when I was writing Rule Breakers, is that they care about the bits that are relevant to them. So, for instance, if you're interviewing farmers, they'll know a lot about energy policy and wind turbines. If you're interviewing, women in housing estates in Laois, they'll know a bit about childcare policy. So people tend to focus in on the bits that pertain to them and leave, I'd imagine a lot of readers, for instance, of the Irish Farmers Journal know who the Minister for Agriculture is. But I suppose what I think we need to think about, and I think in fairness this is what the President was getting at, is the longer term consequences of the choices that we make. Not just in terms of the vote that people will be making on February 26th, but also in terms of how we engage with politicians and the messages that we send to politicians. Because so many politicians said to me when I interviewed them, if somebody comes to me and asks me to do something and I say no, I have to go to Dublin and be part of the banking inquiry, they'll go down the road to the next guy and he'll get the vote. So there's a sense that they are responding to what the voters are demanding. And I think we do give out a lot about politicians in Ireland, and much of that may be fair enough, but there is also an onus on voters themselves to think about their own behaviours going into the next Dáil.
Well, I think that wasn't too unimpressive, actually. 5% think that Fine Gael would introduce a wealth tax, and that means 95% think the opposite, which is quite impressive. And apart from the inappropriateness of the President finger wagging the people and what they should and shouldn't do coming up on the eve of an election, I think it's entirely inappropriate that the people should get stuck into this election. It's one opportunity, probably in 5 years again, I hope, for any sort of a very qualified involvement in politics. And I go back to the original point. It is very important that constituency representatives emerge from, let's say, Galway, Clare or Limerick or whatever, and they argue their corner for development in those regions. I think it's very, very important that that happens, rather than it all be sucked in.
But sure, if they spend most of their time looking after potholes and medical cards, how are they going to have time to do that?
Well, I mean, that's suggesting that local democratically elected representatives should not know of the problems that exist within their constituency. I think it's quite insulting and quite farcical and a complete argument for detaching representatives from their local people and the local citizens that they're supposed to represent.
There's one modest suggestion which has been made from time to time, not just in Ireland but internationally, that we would make more recourse to referenda and local referenda, so that people have an actual direct say, for instance, in a local authority setting its budget priorities and allocating and saying we want this amount of money spent on the roads or the cleaning and environmental service. And I think that's something that people should be looking at, because, you know, we put ourselves out there in the world, and I know this very well as a Minister for Science and Technology at one stage here, that, you know, we put ourselves out there as being at the cutting edge of getting all these technology companies to locate and start up here. We need to use the available technology to involve people more in quotidian decisions that they can make themselves without the assistance of the public representatives, whether it be local authority or national representatives, that we can and do have the technology now, looking forward the next 5-10 years, to allow people to actually make basic elemental decisions, even decisions about the budget parameters. You know, we're having a big debate, as you know, over the last 24 hours, but, you know, what figure is right? I mean, I'm open to the idea, I hope other people are too, that we allow people to actually decide what they want as the broad parameters of budget spending for the years ahead, and then let the politicians implement that. I mean, I think this is a more, you know, vibrant way to look at how democracy works in a modern age of technology.
But Dan, you'd have to hope with whatever method you use to do that, whatever architecture you use for the choice, that people wouldn't go the short-term route. People wouldn't say, as they have done before, oh, goody, tax cuts, that's great.
Well, I think one of the risks of those kind of things is that the more people vote, the lower turnout goes. That you see that at local elections is lower than at national elections. You see it in referendums in Switzerland, because they have a lot of them. The turnout tends to be low. So if we were asking people to do this a lot, you could get a situation where you get a very low turnout, and then small groups could influence the decisions. And, you know, representative democracy over direct democracy, the advantage is that people say, okay, we're handing this over to you. If you mess it up, we'll vote. But it means that we don't have to spend an awful lot of time going into the nitty-gritty. You know, I'm not sure that many people tonight would be sitting down looking through fiscal space documentation, looking through all those numbers and trying to work out, you know, exactly what all this means. If people had to vote on things like fiscal space, how many people would actually spend their evening sitting down poring over documents about fiscal space? Well,
I'm quite surprised at that, because actually in the last few years, we'll call it the second half of my 14-year career in the Dáil, I was actually amazed at, even on FOI, how some constituents were better informed than my colleague deputies, because they actually were prepared to do the research on a very local type issues and find out the actual facts and go right into the local authority files and find out exactly what the position was. So a lot of bluffers got caught out because of that, which was quite interesting. So, you know, I'm not as negative about it. You can set thresholds, by the way. You can set thresholds in terms of referendum, which mean that if it doesn't pass a certain number of people have to vote turnout, that they can be.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for the minute. We'll see you in part 2 when we'll be taking a look at tomorrow's papers. But if anyone out there is thinking of taking to the doorsteps in search of votes, here's David McSavage again, illustrating an approach that just might work.
What are you doing here? I mean, seriously, what are you doing here?
Oh, please. I'm not here to argue. I make mistakes. But genuinely, things will be different.
I don't know. I'm sick of you coming around here whenever it suits you. You're never going to change.
I am changing. I have changed. I just want to build a future for us together. I want to make things better.
I don't know.
Why don't you just have a read of this, okay? Maybe you'll give me your second preference.